There are many reasons a person's remains may be exhumed from their grave. In some cultures, it is part of their funeral rites, leaving the body to skeletonize underground and then digging up the skeleton and putting the bones elsewhere. Remains can also be exhumed when there was a mistake and the person was buried in the wrong grave, or on coroner's orders for forensic investigation, for scientific investigation, or to enable the closure of a cemetery for redevelopment. But in this video, we're looking at the process of exhumation of one person's remains due to family wishes. And if you enjoy this video and learn something new, please like and share it, and perhaps subscribe to the channel. All your support is much appreciated. Now let's talk exhumation in Australia. So the question is, why might a family choose to exhume their loved one's remains? Generally speaking, it seems to be about unity of the family unit. They may have their loved one exhumed in order to return them to their country of origin, or the family may be permanently moving overseas and not wish to leave their loved one behind, or the family may wish to bring all their deceased family members together to be buried in one place. The reasons vary. But you can't just walk into a cemetery's office with a shovel saying, "I'm going to go dig up grandma." So how do you make it happen? Now, each state in Australia have their own laws regarding exhumation, but they are very similar. Additionally, difference in the process will come down to whether the remains are in a public or private cemetery, as well as if it is an open or closed cemetery. But the first step is always to work out who has the legal right to authorize an exhumation. Just like there is a hierarchy in the order of people when someone dies without a will or is unable to give medical consent in hospital, and we have videos about all of those if you're interested, so too is there a hierarchy for exhumation. And at the top is whoever the executor of the deceased will was, followed by the deceased spouse, their children, then their parents, then their siblings. As you can imagine, if the deceased has been in the ground for 50 years or more, that list is going to be pretty short. It should also be mentioned that the spouse can veto the decision to exhume the deceased. Also, if it is an adult child of the deceased wishing to exhume their parent, then all other siblings must sign off that it is a harmonious decision. Lastly, if the original person who signed for and organised the original burial is not a family member, written approval and agreement is usually required by them to exhume the deceased remains. And this is all just step one. The point is, your grandma is not going to be nicked from the cemetery by your evil cousin. The next step is the first part of the paperwork, applying to the state's health department, and that would be the state that your deceased is buried in. In some states, this is called an application to exhume remains. In others, it's called an application for an exhumation license, and they cost around $200. And this is where you need to have all your ducks in a row with family members, because if there is even a slight suggestion that not everyone is in agreement, the application will be denied. Within this application, there are two very important parts. The first is the intentions in writing from the funeral director, in which they state that they have sufficient understanding of the process, the professional standards and qualifications, equipment, training and insurances to carry out the task of exhumation to completion. This is because they need to abide by and are responsible for the entire process under these laws. The Public Health Act of 1991, the Public Health Disposal of Bodies Regulation of 2002, Work Health and Safety Act of 2011, Heritage Act of 1977 and the Coroners Act of 1980. The second part is probably the most important. The intentions in writing of the next of kin, which explains why the deceased is being exhumed and what the plans are to do with the remains. Now, I'm sure there are people who will jump up and down screaming, "That's my family, I can do whatever I want." No, you can't. Sit back down. Most people wishing to exhume their loved ones have a perfectly acceptable, sound and well thought out reason for doing so. But some don't, and these include those in grief making unhealthy decisions and those with a vengeful nature. And there are many historical accounts of these motives playing out. And the health department has a duty of care, which is why the application process takes so long. But let's say it has all gone well and now we have approval. What's next? Well, now we need to get approval from the cemetery itself. Most cemeteries have the legal right to approve or deny exhumations within their land, but this is mostly a formality as the application is usually almost identical to the health department's. Once they have approved the application to exhume, it's on to the practicalities of it all. There are are a lot of logistics involved with an exhumation. You can't just have a coffin dug up at any time, as there are other considerations to take into account. You don't want a funeral service happening at the same time in the area that you're exhuming it. You don't want it to be a busy time at the cemetery like Mother's Day or Christmas, and you need to account for the weather. Coincidentally, the vast majority of exhumations are carried out very early in the morning because this is the quietest time. Frankly, other families visiting the cemetery to pay respect to their loved ones must be protected from the potential unpleasantness and distress an exhumation can cause. The funeral director and the cemetery board will organise the appropriate time and practicalities of all this. Now for a very blunt look at reality. We have said multiple times on this channel how lavish caskets and the like are sold to give the illusion that your loved one will be gently resting in peace. Yeah, well, exhumation is about to prove that wrong. The condition of the casket or coffin and the remains depends on many factors, including how long they've been buried, the material used in the making of the coffin or casket, the composition of the surrounding soil, the location of the ground in either wet or dry surroundings, and the temperature range of the locality of the cemetery. Sometimes a casket will hold together during an exhumation, but a lot of the times it won't. The smooth way it happens on crime TV shows just isn't realistic. With this in mind, possibly the most important rule that the health department and the cemetery will enforce is that no unnecessary parties may be in attendance. This specifically pertains to family members and those who knew the deceased. Now, should you wish to have a witness present, perhaps to assure that the remains are treated respectfully, you may, but the law requires that this person be of a certain social standing, usually a police officer, solicitor, or religious leader. And often a health inspector will also be present to ensure all legal and risk management requirements are carried out. And their job is to ensure the correct grave is open, the exhumation commences as early as possible in the morning to ensure maximum privacy, the plot is screened for appropriate privacy, the health and safety of all the workers is maintained, everyone present shows due respect to the deceased and to the adjoining graves, the nameplate on the casket corresponds to that of the license, the new casket has been approved, all human remains and all pieces of the casket are placed into the new casket, the new casket is properly sealed, the area of the exhumation is properly disinfected, and satisfactory arrangements are in place for the onward transmission of the remains. In case you were wondering, here in Australia, cemetery maintenance workers and the funeral director work together to conduct the exhumation. A cemetery worker is not allowed to handle the casket or the remains. That is a job only for the funeral director. However, cemetery workers are in charge of digging up and around the casket and using any machinery necessary to lift the casket out. But this is often not possible, and since they are the only ones allowed to handle the remains, a funeral director will usually get into the grave to assess the best way to successfully remove the remains. It is therefore the cemetery worker's job to ensure that the grave has appropriate scaffolding to prevent a cave-in. This is a unique case where a grave vault would actually be handy, but as we've said in our Australian Cemeteries video, we don't use grave vaults or liners all that often here in Australia, like many other countries do, such as the US. So, now the remains are up and out of the grave and secure in the new casket. The funeral director is now in charge of getting the remains to where they need to go. Remember how we mentioned the $200 application fee? There are actually many more costs involved, and exhumation is not cheap. The other costs to consider include the removal of memorials on all relevant graves, the health department fee, funeral directors' charges that will often include a new coffin, cemetery fee and charges, and the repatriation and/or the reburial costs. So that is how the exhumation process happens here in Australia. It is not easy or cheap, and it doesn't look like it does on TV. Shocker, I know. Did you learn something new? If so, give us a like and consider subscribing. Thanks for watching from Gary and I. Now go talk death.